I activate Pot of Greed, does anybody know what the heck this card does? Pot of Greed, one of the most iconic cards in the entire game of Yu-Gi-Oh! With how much text modern cards can tote around to the dismay of many a Yu-Gi boomer, Pot of Greed is one of the simplest in the card pool of over 10,000. Draw 2 cards, 3 simple words for a simple effect that makes it one of the most powerful ever printed. Okay, that's the modern errata after a few reprints. Back when Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon was first printed, when spell cards were still called magic cards, the effect actually read draw 2 cards from your deck. Recent effect text assuming that players know to draw cards from the top of their deck rather than, the graveyard? Maybe that's why they always announce the effect in the anime.
It allows me to draw 2 cards from my deck.
Those various anime appearances being one of the many ways it gained popularity. Also was just actually really good. Even back during the beginning of the game when it was basically summoning the bigger monster and hoping it stays on the field for at least a turn, drawing 2 cards made a big difference to keep you ahead of your opponent, possibly even drawing one of the many other powerful spell cards that were being printed. Eventually, as competitive play began to form and a ban list was needed to keep things fair, Pot of Greed found itself forbidden to be played. But the ban list is never really the end of the story. Several other pot cards have made their way to print with varying effects. Pot of Generosity, Pot of Avarice, and Pot of Benevolence being the first batch to represent other behaviors. There was also the trap card Jar of Greed, but that one's never really brought up. More recently, there was also Pot of Riches and Pot of Acquisitiveness, all having different degrees of manipulating cards, either returning them to the deck or allowing you to draw 1 or 2 cards after a small cost. Out of these, it was really Pot of Avarice that saw the most play, being a way to recycle monsters from the graveyard while still drawing 2 cards at the end of it. This might look like a nice group of pots with some situational use or really weird gimmicks, but rather than continuing to print even more pots, the design team decided to just start smashing them together. Most of these combo pots are very generic and can actually be used by really any player. Even today, we see different ones being used depending on the kind of deck you're playing. The thing I love most about these is that their effects are actually the result of combining the effects of the cards they're referencing. Take Pot of Duality for example. By combining Pot of Greed, which allows you to draw 2 cards, and Pot of Generosity, which lets you return 2 cards from your hand to the deck, the new effect allows you to reveal the top 3 cards of your deck, adding 1 to your hand and then shuffling the other 2 back into the deck. That's some really cool card design that even fits into the lore of the spells it was built off of. Though of course this was one of the first cards to start adding an additional restriction, that being that you aren't allowed to special summon during the turn you activate this effect. I think the designers were really trying to make sure they didn't accidentally create the next big power card like the original Pot of Greed. Nowadays, if there were a spell that let you draw 2 cards with no drawbacks, cost, or requirement, that would be pretty insane. There have been several other cards that allow the player to draw 2 cards, but have had a requirement of discarding a specific type of other card or destroying it that you control face up on the field. When it comes to math, this becomes a pretty even trade, since you're using 2 cards in order to draw 2 more cards, as opposed to the original Pot of Greed, which was a 2-for-1. And this has been that basis for effects like this during the middle era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where things were starting to get more powerful but still had some balancing built in. While that seemed like a good idea, we need to remember that not all cards exist in a vacuum, so once in a while they'd end up being pretty busted pieces of an already busted deck. Now we're at the point where going -9 with Pot of Desire sounds like a good idea, the craziest part being that it is actually a good idea, fight me. But I love that the iconography of Pot of Greed has been so persistent, also having some of its own lore and variations, I guess you'd call them. Back in the video about perfect counter cards, I already brought up Jar Robber, which specifically negates Pot of Greed. But if you're feeling generous, there's also the trap card Gift of Greed, which allows your opponent to draw 2 cards instead. So I guess the answer to keeping it legal was to pass it on to someone else. But you better watch out because apparently inside the pot is a little monster known as the Spirit of the Pot of Greed. This is a level 1 light attribute fairy type. While it's in face-up attack position, if a player activates Pot of Greed, they're then allowed to draw 1 additional card. I think this is a fun idea for a little monster, even though if Pot of Greed was legal for play, I doubt it would be too useful as you would need to invest a bit into getting it on the field before even activating the spell. If you were playing with house rules, I think it would just be better to get a quick draw 2 in order to build a better strategy. The same goes for Avatar of the Pot, a level 3 Earth attribute rock monster that allows you to send a Pot of Greed from your hand to the graveyard in order to draw 3 cards. More or less the same effect, and like I said, it would just be better to invest that card draw into some more effective strategies. But I think it was still a cool idea to create some additional monsters that were built around this card. There is also a Goblin of Greed, which is seen holding the Pot and Jar of Greed in his arms, though this effect doesn't really tie into the spell card. But there is an entire narrative concerning this Goblin and the Pot that spans the artwork of multiple cards. It'd be worth discussing further at a later time. Also randomly, I guess there's a moray that lives inside the Pot of Greed when it gets submerged in water. Hey, it was decent for water decks. As for the pot itself, I guess it got smashed into pieces at some point because we notably also have the continuous spell card Shard of Greed, which allows you to draw 2 cards provided it's able to remain on the field for 2 turns. I actually find it so funny that this little card that isn't very good or notable has become an extra little staple when it comes to the lore. Sure, Master Duel allows you to have the full Pot of Greed as a mate just like many other iconic spells and monsters, but for some reason you can also have the Shard of Greed as a mate and it just sits there. I actually like using it from time to time because it's so obnoxious with how small it is compared to the others when it shows up in the matchmaking screen or even the actual duel. And of course there's been quite a bit of merchandise in the past few years, which is all pretty cool, though I'm not sure what I would do with a Pot of Greed if I actually own one. I mean, sure, it looks cool, but it won't let me draw 2 cards. But that was just some of the history and discussion about one of the most iconic Yu-Gi-Oh spell cards. I've always thought it was a pretty cool little meme and found it so interesting just how much it continued to influence future cards even if it was banned in competitive play. I guess it just goes to show you how powerful it actually is. So let me know what you think in the comments below and which pot spell card was your favorite throughout all the years. Anyway, this is Gatorax, thank you so much for watching and I'll catch you all later.